The hook. There is a sound that only exists inside a lighthouse. It is not the wind, though the wind is always there, pressing against the granite like a living thing trying to enter. It is not the waves, though they crash and recede in a rhythm older than memory. It is something else. Something that lives in the spiral of the stairs, in the breathing of the lens, in the long, hollow dark between one turning of the light and the next. It is the sound of a man alone. Listen. Close your eyes and listen to the echo of footsteps on stone that has been worn smooth by a century of solitary packing. Hear the scratch of a pen against paper when there is no one left to read the words. Hear the silence that rushes in when the wind forgets to howl, a silence so complete, so absolute, that it begins to press against the ears like water at impossible depth. This is the story of that silence. This is the story of a winter so cold that the sea itself turned to stone, of a man so alone that he began to hear voices in the mechanism of the light, of a logbook kept through months of darkness that would eventually contain something no logbook should ever hold. This is the story of Thomas Howell, keeper of the Mewstone Lighthouse, and the winter of 1901, the winter he stopped recording the weather and started recording something else entirely. The official records tell us little. They say he was relieved of duty in April of 1901, that he was found in a state of profound mental exhaustion, that he spent the remainder of his days in an asylum on the Cornish coast, speaking always of the light and the dark and the space between them where something waited. But the official records do not tell us what filled the pages of his final logbook, the one they found hidden beneath his mattress, the one written in a hand that grew stranger with each passing week, the one that ended with a single sentence repeated 73 times before trailing off into nothing. The official records do not tell us what the relief keepers heard when they first opened the door to the lamp room on that April morning. The official records do not tell us what Thomas Howell saw. But the logbook survives, and if you are willing to listen, truly listen, to what it contains, you may begin to understand why some doors are built to remain closed, why some lights are meant to guide ships away from the rocks, and why some lights only attract what should remain in the deep. Keep the candle lit beside you as you read. Keep it burning until the very last page. Because once you enter the winter of 1901, there is no guarantee you will find your way back out. December 1st, 1900, Plymouth. The fog that morning was the color of old linen. It lay upon Plymouth not as weather but as presence, a thing with weight and intention, curling through the narrow streets, pressing against window glass, muffling the world into a silence that felt almost sacred. The ships in the harbor had vanished into it, their masts becoming ghosts, their hulls becoming memory. Even the gulls had stopped their crying, as if something had told them to wait. Thomas Howell stood at the window of the Trinity House office and watched the fog consume the world. He was 47 years old, though the sea had given him the face of an older man, skin weathered to leather, eyes the pale blue of winter sky, hands that had learned the language of rope and oil and brass. He had served the lighthouse service for 23 years, had kept the light at Start Point, at Lizard, at a dozen smaller stations whose names the maps had forgotten. He knew the rhythm of solitude. He knew the way a man could live inside himself for months at a time, emerging in spring like a creature from hibernation, blinking at the faces of men as if they belonged to a species he no longer recognized. But he had never kept the Mewstone. Behind him, Superintendent Grave shuffled papers at his desk, a sound like dry leaves in an empty courtyard. The office smelled of coal smoke and sealing wax and the faint, persistent damp that followed everything in this coastal city. A clock ticked somewhere in the walls, measuring time as if time were a thing that could be measured. The Mewstone, Grave said, and the word hung in the air like a pronouncement. Thomas did not turn from the window. I know it. Everyone knows it. The question is whether anyone can keep it. There was something in the superintendent's voice that made Thomas finally turn, something careful, something measured, something that suggested words were being chosen with more than usual precision. Grave was a small man, round-shouldered from decades of desk work, his spectacles catching the gray light from the window until his eyes became two circles of nothing. It's a 4-month posting, Grave continued, not meeting Thomas's gaze. December through March, the worst of it. You'll be relieved in April, assuming the weather allows. The weather always allows, Thomas said. Eventually. Eventually, Grav repeated the word as if testing its weight. He picked up a sheet of paper from his desk, held it to the light, set it down again. There's something you should know about the Mewstone, about the previous keeper. Thomas waited. He had learned, in 23 years, that silence was often the most effective question. Man named Elias Thorne took the posting last winter. Experienced keeper, 15 years, never a complaint. We sent him out in November of 99, expected him back in March. Grav paused, and in that pause Thomas heard something he had never heard in the superintendent's voice before, a hesitation, a reluctance, a fear of the words that waited to be spoken. They brought him back in December, before Christmas. He'd been there barely a month. Thomas moved from the window, taking the chair across from Grav's desk. The wood was worn smooth by decades of men sitting in this same position, receiving news that would carry them into solitude. What happened? Grav removed his spectacles, began to polish them with a cloth that seemed always to be in his pocket. It was a delaying tactic, and both men knew it. When the relief boat arrived, he said slowly, they found the tower in perfect order. The light was turning, the lens was clean, the clockwork was wound, everything was as it should be. He put the spectacles back on, and now his eyes were visible again, tired, old, haunted by something they had seen. But Elias Thorne was sitting in the lamp room, in the dark. He had extinguished the light, and he was sitting on the floor with his back to the lens, staring at nothing. He did not speak when they found him. He has not spoken since. The clock ticked. The fog pressed against the window. Somewhere in the harbor, a ship's bell sounded, its note swallowed almost instantly by the muffling grey. They brought him back here, Grav continued, to Plymouth, to the asylum at Stonehouse. The doctors say his mind is absent, present in body only. They do not expect him to recover. Thomas considered this. He considered the weight of it, the shape of it, the way it sat in the room between them like a third presence. 4 months, he said finally, December through March. December through March. Grav nodded, and for a moment something like relief crossed his face, relief that Thomas had not asked the question that hovered in the air, the question that could not be answered, the question that had no name. Thomas reached for the papers on the desk, began to sign where signatures were required. His hand was steady. His hand had always been steady. I'll need supplies for the full term, he said. Paraffin for the lamp, oil for the clockwork, food enough to last until April with a margin for delay. It will be arranged. And I'll need a copy of the previous keeper's log. Standard procedure to understand the patterns of the station, any peculiarities of the equipment. Grav was silent for a moment too long. When he spoke, his voice was carefully empty. The previous keeper's log was incomplete, damaged. It is not available for reference. Thomas looked up from the papers. Damaged how? Water damage, the damp, you understand. It's very damp on the Mewstone. But Thomas did understand. He understood that water damage did not explain the look in Grav's eyes, the hesitation in his voice, the way his hands had begun to shuffle papers with unnecessary urgency. He understood that something had been removed from the official record, something that the Trinity House authorities did not wish to be read. He signed the final paper. He stood. He offered his hand to the superintendent, who took it with fingers that were cold and slightly trembling. The boat leaves at dawn, Grav said. From the Barbican, they'll take you out with the morning tide. Thomas nodded. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle, turned back. The fog had begun to seep through the window frame now, a thin tendril of white that moved in the still air like something searching. What was his name again? Thomas asked. The previous keeper. Grav looked at him, and for a moment his face was naked in a way that men's faces rarely are, stripped of pretense, stripped of office, stripped of everything except a fear so old it might have been carved into his bones. Thorne, he said, Elias Thorne, but that is not the name he whispered when they found him. The fog moved, the clock ticked. Thomas waited. He whispered a name, Grav said, that belonged to no one, a name that meant nothing, a name that could not exist. He did not speak that name aloud. He did not need to. In the silence that followed, Thomas heard it anyway, heard it in the breathing of the fog, in the ticking of the clock, in the distant cry of a gull that had forgotten to be silent. He left the office, walked out into the muffled white, and began the long descent toward the harbor where the boat waited to carry him into the winter of 1901. The fog did not lift that day. Thomas moved through it like a man walking through memory, each step uncertain, each landmark emerging from the grey only to vanish behind him. The streets of Plymouth had become a labyrinth, familiar shapes rendered strange by the absence of distance. He passed the tavern where he had drunk with other keepers in other years, the church where his mother's funeral had been held, the shop where he bought the tobacco he would carry with him into solitude. All of it softened, blurred, made insubstantial by the fog that seemed to thicken as evening approached. He found a room for the night in a boarding house near the Barbican, a narrow building that leaned against its neighbors as if exhausted by the effort of standing. The landlady was a widow with eyes the color of sea-washed glass, and she asked no questions as she showed him to a room overlooking the harbor. Perhaps she had learned, in years of letting rooms to men who would leave at dawn, that questions only complicated the leaving. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and watched the fog through the window. It moved in currents now, stirred by a wind that had not yet reached the streets below. Shapes formed and dissolved within it, the suggestion of a ship's mast, the ghost of a rigging line, something that might have been a face pressed against the glass before the currents shifted, and it was gone. He thought about Elias Thorne. He thought about a man who had kept the light for 15 years, who had been found after 1 month on the Mewstone sitting in darkness, staring at nothing, whispering a name that could not exist. He thought about the missing logbook, the damaged pages, the careful way Grave had chosen his words. He thought about the fog and what it concealed and what it revealed. Downstairs, a door opened and closed, footsteps on the stairs, a knock at his door, 3 slow raps, spaced as carefully as the words of a warning. The man who stood in the hallway was old, older than Thomas by 20 years, older than the century itself by the look of him. He wore the clothes of a sailor, but the clothes were worn unevenly, as if they had been put on in darkness. His face was a map of crossings, each line a voyage, each crease a storm survived. "You're the new keeper," he said, "not a question." Thomas nodded. The man's eyes moved past him, into the room, to the fog at the window, to the bag packed and waiting by the bed. "The Mewstone," the man said. "You're going to the Mewstone." "Yes." The old sailor stood in the doorway, not entering, not leaving. The gaslight from the hallway caught his face at an angle that turned his eyes into pools of shadow. "I was on the boat," he said, "when we brought him back, Thorne." Thomas felt something shift in the room, a change in pressure, a thickening of the air, the same subtle wrongness he had felt in Grave's office when the superintendent spoke of damaged logs and impossible names. "What happened?" Thomas asked. "On the boat." The old sailor was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man describing something he had spent a year trying to forget. He didn't speak the whole crossing, didn't move, sat in the bow with his face to the sea, even when the spray was freezing on his skin. We thought he was in shock, you understand. The solitude, the dark, the way a man's mind can turn on him when he's alone too long. We've all seen it. We've all felt the edge of it on the long nights when the wind won't stop. He paused. The fog at the window seemed to press closer, as if listening. But it wasn't that. It wasn't shock. It was waiting. He was waiting for something. And when we were halfway across the Sound, when there was nothing but water and fog and the space between, he turned to us, turned and looked at us with eyes that were not his eyes, and he spoke. Thomas waited. The old sailor's hands had begun to tremble, slight movements, almost imperceptible, the tremor of a man who has carried a weight too long. He spoke a name, the sailor said, one name, over and over, a name that made no sense, that had no meaning, that could not belong to anyone living or dead. And as he spoke it, the fog began to move, not with the wind, with something else, something that was listening. Silence filled the hallway, the gaslight flickered. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 8, each note swallowed by the fog as if the fog were hungry. "They say he's in the asylum now," the sailor continued. "They say he doesn't speak at all anymore, but I know different. I know that sometimes in the night the nurses hear him, not speaking, listening to something that speaks to him from the dark, and they say that when they open his door, the room is cold, colder than it should be, colder than any room in England has any right to be. He looked at Thomas then, looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, that had crossed too many boundaries between the world that was and the world that waited just beyond the reach of light. "Don't go," he said. "Find another posting, claim sickness, do whatever you must, but do not go to that rock. There are places where men were never meant to be alone, and that is one of them. There are lights that show the way, and there are lights that call things in from the dark. The Mewstone calls." He turned before Thomas could answer. His footsteps retreated down the stairs, slow, heavy, the footsteps of a man carrying a weight that would never lift. The door to the street opened and closed, and then there was only the fog and the silence and the ticking of a clock that measured time that might not exist. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after the old sailor left. He watched the fog move at the window. He thought about Elias Thorne, about the name he had whispered, about the cold that filled his room in the asylum when something spoke to him from the dark. He thought about the missing logbook and the damaged pages and the careful way Grave had avoided his eyes. Then he lay down, closed his eyes, and waited for dawn. The fog waited with him. December 3rd, 1900, the English Channel. Dawn came grey and silent, as if the sun had forgotten the way. Thomas stood on the Barbican steps with his bag at his feet and watched the boat take shape in the retreating fog. It was a cutter, 20 feet at the waterline, manned by two men who moved with the economy of those who had spent their lives on the water. They did not speak as they made the boat ready. They did not look at him. They worked in a silence that felt deliberate, as if words had been left behind on shore with the rest of the world. The fog was lifting, but slowly, reluctantly, like a curtain drawn back from a stage that did not wish to be seen. Patches of open water appeared between the tendrils of white, dark and cold, and deeply still. The air smelled of salt and tar and something else, something metallic, something that touched the back of the throat like the taste of old iron. "Mr. Howell." The voice came from behind him. Thomas turned to find a man in the uniform of the Trinity House Service, young, perhaps 30, with the eager alertness of those who had not yet learned to fear the sea. He carried a canvas-wrapped bundle under one arm, and his face was flushed with the cold. "Forgot this at the office," the young man said, extending the bundle. "Superintendent Grave asked me to bring it, said you'd need it for the crossing." Thomas took the bundle, felt its weight, its shape. He knew without unwrapping it that it was a logbook, the standard Trinity House log, bound in canvas, ruled for weather observations and maintenance records, and the daily notations that kept a keeper connected to the world he had left behind. "The previous keeper's log?" he asked. The young man's flush deepened, though whether from cold or something else, Thomas could not tell. "No, sir, a new one," the superintendent said. He said the old one was unavailable. "Unavailable?" "Yes, sir." The young man's eyes flickered toward the boat, toward the water, toward anything but Thomas's face. "Damaged, sir, beyond repair." Thomas looked down at the logbook in his hands. New canvas, fresh binding, pages clean and white and waiting to be filled. A record that would begin with him, that would contain only his winter, his observations, his descent. A record that would tell the authorities exactly what they wished to know and nothing more. "Thank you," he said. "You can tell the superintendent that I received it." The young man nodded, touched his cap in something between a salute and a farewell, and disappeared back into the fog that still clung to the streets above the harbor. Thomas carried the logbook to the boat. The two men at the oars watched him approach, their faces expressionless. One of them, older, with a beard the color of sea foam, reached up to take his bag as he stepped aboard. The boat shifted beneath his weight, finding its balance, accepting him. "Ready, sir?" The older man's voice was rough, unused to conversation. Thomas nodded. He settled onto the thwart near the stern, the new logbook on his knees, his eyes on the harbor mouth where the open water waited. The older man pushed off from the steps. The younger man took the oars, and the boat began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing purpose, cutting through the last of the harbor fog toward the channel beyond. Behind them, Plymouth dissolved into memory. Ahead, the sea opened like a question that had no answer. For the first hour, there was only water. The fog had lifted completely now, burned away by a sun that remained hidden behind high cloud. The channel spread around them in all directions, grey and vast and empty, an infinity of water that reduced the boat to a speck, the men to atoms, their passage to a temporary disturbance in a surface that would close behind them as if they had never been. Thomas watched the horizon. He had made this crossing before to other stations in other years. He knew the way the sea could shrink a man down to nothing, could remind him with every wave of how small he was, how temporary, how easily erased. But this crossing felt different. This crossing felt like a passage between worlds, not a journey across water, but a journey out of the world entirely, into a realm where the rules of men no longer applied. The older man at the tiller watched him watching. After a long silence, he spoke. "You'll see it soon. Another hour, maybe less. The rock shows itself when it wants to be seen." Thomas nodded. "You've made this crossing before." "Many times, too many times." The man's eyes were the color of the sea, grey, depthless, old. "I've taken keepers out to the Mewstone for 23 years. I've brought some of them back." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Thomas waited, but the man offered nothing more. The younger man pulled at the oars with steady rhythm, his face turned away, his shoulders rising and falling like the breathing of the sea itself. The sky changed as they traveled. The high cloud thickened, darkened, pressed lower, until it seemed to merge with the water at the horizon. The light took on a quality Thomas had seen before only in the furthest northern stations, a grey luminescence that came from everywhere and nowhere, that cast no shadows, that flattened the world into two dimensions. And then, without warning, the rock was there. It rose from the sea like the last remnant of a drowned world, a tooth of black granite that seemed to have been thrust upward by some terrible pressure from below. The lighthouse stood at its summit, a white tower that should have been visible for miles, but had somehow concealed itself until this moment. It was taller than Thomas had expected, narrower, more fragile, a needle of human making pinned to the stone by nothing but faith and the careful work of masons long dead. "There," the older man said, "the Mewstone." Boat drew closer, and Thomas began to understand. The rock was not a single mass, but a collection of smaller outcrops, linked by ridges that disappeared and reappeared with the swell. The lighthouse rose from the highest point, its base perhaps 50 feet above the water at high tide, its gallery another 100 feet above that. A landing stage clung to the rock at the limit of the waves, a wooden platform that looked as if it had been rebuilt many times, each rebuilding a little more desperate than the last. "There's a stair," the younger man said, speaking for the first time. "Cut into the rock, 250 steps to the top. You'll feel every one of them by the time you've carried your supplies up." Thomas looked at the stair, a dark line ascending the face of the rock, barely visible against the black granite. It rose and rose, disappearing into the grey sky, reappearing higher up, finally reaching the base of the tower, where a door waited like the entrance to a tomb. The boat bumped against the landing stage. The older man caught the edge with a practiced hand, held them steady against the swell. "Best go quickly, sir," he said. "The weather's turning. We'll not want to be on the water when it does." Thomas stood, his legs finding their balance on the shifting deck. He handed his bag to the younger man, who scrambled onto the landing stage with a rope. Then he followed, stepping from boat to rock, feeling the solidity of stone beneath his feet for the first time in hours. The supplies came next, boxes and barrels and canvas sacks, handed up from the boat in a rhythm that spoke of long practice. Thomas helped to stack them on the landing stage, working alongside the two men in a silence that had become natural. The sea slapped against the rock below them, hungry and patient. When the last box was ashore, the older man straightened and looked at Thomas with those grey, depthless eyes. "We'll be back in April," he said, "weather permitting. If you need us before then," he shrugged, a gesture that said everything about the impossibility of need, the irrelevance of want, the absolute isolation of the place where Thomas now stood. "April," Thomas repeated, "I'll be here." The older man nodded. He returned to the boat, took his place at the tiller. The younger man pushed off from the landing stage, and the boat began to drift away from the rock, slowly at first, then more quickly as the current caught it. Thomas watched them go. He watched the boat shrink against the vastness of the sea, watched the two men become specks, become memory, become nothing. He watched until the boat was indistinguishable from the water, until the horizon had swallowed it completely, until he was alone on a tooth of rock in the middle of the grey channel with 250 steps between him and the shelter that waited above. The wind picked up, cold and sharp. The sky darkened. Somewhere below him, the sea began to speak in a voice that was older than language. Thomas turned away from the water, lifted the nearest box, and began to climb. 250 steps. Thomas counted them as he climbed, not because he needed to know the number, but because counting gave his mind something to hold onto, something to separate him from the vastness of the space that opened behind him with each step upward. The stair was narrow, cut into the living rock, worn smooth by decades of solitary feet. To his left, the tower rose, its white surface streaked with salt and birdlime. To his right, nothing but air and the long drop to the sea that boiled against the rocks below. He climbed in stages, carrying what he could, returning to the landing stage for more. Each ascent took him higher, each descent returned him to the sound of waves and the smell of salt and the growing awareness that the light was fading. By the time he carried the last box up the final flight, his legs were burning and his breath came in clouds that the wind tore away before they could form. The door at the top of the stair was iron, painted the same white as the tower, its surface pitted with rust where the salt had eaten through. Above it, a lantern cast a weak light, not lit now, but waiting for darkness, waiting for the moment when Thomas would climb higher still and set the great lamp burning. He set down the box, found the key in his pocket, fitted it to the lock. The mechanism turned with a protest of old metal, a sound that spoke of infrequent use, of doors that opened only when the sea allowed. The door swung inward. Thomas stepped through, and the tower received him. The sound changed immediately, the howl of wind replaced by the hush of stone, the crash of waves reduced to a distant murmur, as if the sea had been asked to wait outside. He stood in a small entry room, its walls curved to follow the tower's circle, its floor worn stone. A stair rose before him, spiraling upward into dimness. A door to his left opened onto what appeared to be a storage cellar, dark and cold. The air smelled of oil and old smoke, and something else, something sweet and faintly corrupt, like flowers left too long in water. Thomas closed the outer door. The sound of its shutting was absolute, final, a seal placed between himself and the world he had left behind. He stood in the sudden silence and listened to his own breathing, to the beating of his own heart, to the small sounds that were already beginning to define themselves against the quiet. The tower breathed around him. He could feel it in the stone, in the slow movement of air from below to above, in the creak of timbers somewhere in the darkness overhead. It was not alive. He knew that, knew it with the certainty of a rational man, but it was not dead either. It was something between, something that had stood here for 100 years, something that had absorbed the solitude of every keeper who had passed through its door. Thomas picked up the nearest box and began to climb the spiral stair toward the living quarters above. Behind him, in the darkness of the storage cellar, something shifted. It was a small sound, barely audible, the sound of stone against stone, the sound of something moving that should not move. Thomas paused, listening, but the sound did not repeat. After a long moment, he continued upward, telling himself it was only the settling of the tower, the expansion and contraction of stone in the changing temperature, the thousand small noises that any old building makes. But as he climbed, he could not shake the feeling that he was not alone, that something had been waiting for him, that the door, when it opened, had let in more than just a man. December 5th, December 15th, 1900, the first days. The first week passed in a rhythm as old as the lighthouse service itself. Thomas woke each morning to the grey light that seeped through the small window of his sleeping room, a circular chamber just below the lamp room, furnished with a cot, a stove, a table, a chair. He rose, washed in water drawn from the cistern that collected rain from the gallery above, dressed in the clothes that hung from pegs on the curved wall. Then he climbed the final flight of stairs to the lamp room and began the day's work. The lamp was the heart of the tower, a first-order Fresnel lens, its glass prisms arranged in concentric rings that gathered the light from a single oil flame and threw it across the sea in a beam visible for 20 miles. It floated on a bed of mercury, turning on wheels that required winding every 2 hours through the night, a clockwork mechanism that had to be kept clean, oiled, adjusted, loved. Thomas tended it with the care of a priest tending an altar. He polished the glass until it gleamed, trimmed the wicks to exact length, checked the level of oil in the reservoir, recorded every detail in the new logbook that lay open on the small desk in the corner of the lamp room. The log was his connection to the world, his proof that he existed, his record of the small events that marked the passage of time when time itself had become meaningless. December 5, 1900. Wind, NNE force 4, sea state, moderate, visibility, 8 miles, light lit at 16:32, extinguished at 07:18. Clockwork wound every 2 hours through the night, no vessels sighted. The days took on a shape. Morning chores in the lamp room, afternoon maintenance below, checking the stores, cleaning the living quarters, preparing meals. Evening ascent to light the lamp and begin the night watch. The 2-hour intervals between windings became islands of time, each one a small world in which Thomas read, wrote letters he could not send, sat in the darkness of the lamp room, and watched the beam turn and turn and turn. The beam was hypnotic in its regularity. It swept the sea in an arc of light, disappearing into the darkness, reappearing on the opposite side, sweeping again. Thomas found himself watching it for hours, following its progress, imagining the ships that might be guided by it, the sailors who might see it as a promise of safety, a reassurance that land existed, that the world continued beyond the darkness of the sea. But there were no ships. The winter shipping lanes were quiet, the traffic reduced to nothing by the storms that were already beginning to gather in the west. Some nights, Thomas saw nothing but the beam and the darkness and the faint gleam of water where the light touched it. Some nights, the beam seemed to be sweeping an empty world, a world from which all life had been withdrawn. On the 6th night, he began to hear it. A sound in the tower below him, a sound that was not the wind, not the settling of stone, not the creak of old timbers, a sound that was almost the sound of footsteps. He listened from the lamp room, his hand on the clockwork mechanism, feeling the vibration of the turning lens through his palm. The sound came again, soft, careful, the sound of something moving with deliberate slowness on the stairs below. Thomas took the lantern from its hook and began to descend. The spiral stair curved away into darkness, each step echoing in the narrow space. He moved slowly, holding the lantern high, watching the shadows shift and reform with each change in his position. The sound had stopped now, replaced by a silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat, the rush of blood in his ears, the tiny sounds of his clothing against the stone. He reached the living quarters. Empty. The stove was cold, the table bare, the cot neatly made. He continued down, past the storage room, past the cistern room, down toward the entry where the outer door waited. The door was closed, locked, as he had left it. Thomas stood in the entry, listening. The sea murmured outside, a constant presence, a voice that never stopped. The tower breathed around him, its stone walls holding the cold of winter, the damp of centuries. Nothing moved, nothing spoke. He climbed back to the lamp room, wound the clockwork, recorded the hour in the log. He did not write about the sound he had heard. Some things, he told himself, were not worth recording. Some things were only the imagination playing tricks in the dark. But as he sat through the remaining hours of the night, watching the beam turn and turn, he found himself listening, always listening, waiting for the sound to come again. It did not come that night, but it would come again. On the 10th day, Thomas began to write letters. It was a habit he had developed in his early years of keeping, a way of maintaining connection, of holding onto the shape of conversation even when there was no one to converse with. He wrote to his sister in Bristol, to the friends he had made at other stations, to the superintendent at Trinity House, with reports that duplicated the information in the official log. He wrote about the weather, the state of the lamp, the small events of his days, a bird that had landed on the gallery rail, a particularly brilliant sunset, the taste of the bread he had baked in the small stove. He did not write about the sounds. He did not write about the feeling that sometimes visited him in the darkness, the feeling that he was being watched, observed, studied by something that waited just beyond the reach of the light. December 12, 1900. My dear Margaret, the winter here is quieter than I expected. The storms have not yet arrived, though the men at the landing stage warned me they would. The light burns steadily, and I have found a kind of peace in the routine. I think of you often, of the sound of your voice, of the way the light falls across your kitchen table in the afternoons. I will be home in April, and we will sit at that table together, And I will tell you of this place, and you will tell me of the world, and for a time we will pretend that I have never been away." He folded the letter, placed it with the others, sealed them all in an envelope that would wait on the table until April. There was no post from the Mewstone. There was only the waiting, the routine, the long descent into the self that solitude made possible. That night, the wind rose. It came from the west, from the Atlantic, from the vast emptiness where the sea stretched uninterrupted to America. It struck the tower with a force that made the stone shudder, that pressed against the windows until the glass seemed to bow inward, that filled the air with a howling that never stopped, never varied, never relented. Thomas wound the clockwork through the night, climbing to the lamp room every 2 hours, feeling the tower shake around him. The beam turned steadily, sweeping across a sea that had become white with foam, across waves that rose and fell with the weight of mountains. He watched from the gallery door, holding tight to the iron rail, feeling the spray on his face, even though the waves were 100 feet below. The sound, when it came again, was almost lost in the storm. Almost. It was there, beneath the howl of wind, beneath the crash of waves, beneath the groan of stone under stress, a sound that was not of the storm, that did not belong to the natural order of things, a sound that was footsteps climbing the spiral stair. Thomas turned from the gallery, stepped back into the lamp room, closed the door behind him. The sound continued, slow, deliberate, ascending. He could hear it clearly now, each step distinct, each pause measured, each movement a statement of presence. He took the lantern, he descended. The stair was empty. The sound stopped when he began to move, started again when he paused, as if whatever made it was matching his pace, staying always just beyond the reach of light. He reached the living quarters. Empty, the storage room, empty, the cistern room, empty, the entry with its locked door. Empty. Thomas stood in the entry, breathing hard, the lantern casting his shadow huge against the curved wall. The storm howled outside. The tower shook, and in the silence between gusts, he heard it again, the sound of footsteps, not on the stairs this time, but somewhere below. Somewhere in the darkness of the storage cellar, where the stone walls held the cold of centuries and the shadows were absolute. He approached the cellar door. It was closed, as always. He had not opened it since his first day, when he had stored the supplies that would not fit in the upper rooms. He had not needed to. The door was there, but it was not part of his routine. He reached for the handle. The sound stopped. The storm paused. The tower held its breath. Thomas opened the door. The cellar was dark, darker than any darkness he had ever known. The lantern light reached only a few feet into it, revealing stone walls, stone floor, the shapes of barrels and boxes stacked against the far wall. Nothing moved, nothing spoke. The air was cold and still and smelled of salt, and something else, something organic, something that had once been alive. He stepped inside, holding the lantern high. The light moved across the walls, across the stacked supplies, across the floor. And there, in the corner where the darkness was thickest, he saw it. A stone, loose, slightly displaced from the others, as if it had been moved recently and not quite returned to its place. Thomas approached it, knelt, set the lantern on the floor. He worked his fingers into the gap between the stones, felt them move, felt the give that should not exist in a wall built to withstand the sea. The stone came out easily. Behind it there was a space, a hollow in the wall, deliberately made, deliberately hidden, and in that hollow something waited. A book, small, leather-bound, its cover stained with damp, a journal. Thomas reached for it, lifted it from its hiding place, held it in hands that had begun to tremble. On the cover, in letters that had faded almost to nothing, a name was written. Elias Thorne. Thomas carried the journal back to the lamp room. He did not know why he chose that place, perhaps because it was the highest point in the tower, the closest to the light, the furthest from whatever waited in the darkness below. Perhaps because he needed to read by the beam that turned and turned, as if that turning could somehow protect him from whatever the journal contained. He sat on the floor with his back against the lens mechanism, feeling its vibration through the stone, and opened the first page. The handwriting was small, precise, the handwriting of a meticulous man. Dated November 15th, 1899, the day Elias Thorne had arrived at the Mewstone for his winter posting. November 15th, 1899, Arrived at the Mewstone today. The crossing was rough, the men at the oars silent. They seem to regard this place with something approaching fear. I do not understand why. The tower is sound, the light well-maintained, the quarters comfortable. I shall be content here until spring. Thomas turned the page. The entries continued, day by day, recording the same routines he himself had followed. The winding of the clockwork, the polishing of the lens, the recording of the weather, the long nights of watching. November 22nd, 1899. A strange sound in the tower tonight. I thought at first it was the wind, but the wind has been still for hours. It was like footsteps moving on the stairs below me. I searched but found nothing, probably only the settling of the stone. November 28th, 1899. The sound again, louder now, more distinct. It seems to be packing, moving up and down the stairs at all hours. I have checked every room, every corner. There is nothing here. There is no one here. I am alone. December 3rd, 1899. I have begun to hear voices, faint, indistinct, as if carried from a great distance. They speak in the night, when the lamp is lit and the beam is turning. They speak of things I do not understand. I have tried to ignore them, but they persist. They are patient. Thomas read on, the beam turning above him, the storm howling outside. The entries grew longer, more detailed, more strange. December 10th, 1899. The voices have names now. They tell me their names when I listen closely. Names I have never heard before, names that belong to no language I know. They say they have been here always. They say they were here before the tower was built, before the rock rose from the sea, before the world was the world. They say they will be here after. December 15th, 1899. I have found something in the cellar, a loose stone, a hollow behind it. I do not know who placed it there or why, but I have begun to leave things in the hollow. Small things, offerings. The voices seem pleased. Thomas felt the cold then, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter wind, nothing to do with the stone floor beneath him. He looked up from the journal, looked toward the stairs that led down into darkness, thought of the hollow in the cellar wall and the stone he had replaced after taking the journal. Offerings, Elias had written. He had left offerings. December 22nd, 1899. The shortest day, the longest night. The voices are with me constantly now. They speak even in daylight, even when the lamp is extinguished. They tell me stories of the deep, of the spaces between worlds, of the things that wait in the darkness where light has never reached. They tell me I am chosen. They tell me I will never leave. December 24th, 1899. I have stopped recording the weather. What does the weather matter when the world is ending? What does the light matter when something else is calling? I have let them in. I did not mean to. I only wanted to hear another voice. But now they are here, and they will not leave, and they know my name. The entries after that were fragmentary, words crossed out, lines that trailed into nothing, pages smeared as if with tears or seawater. Thomas turned them carefully, reading what he could, feeling the weight of each broken sentence. Cannot close my eyes without seeing them. The light shows the way, but the way leads nowhere. They are in the walls now, in the stone, in the space between my thoughts. And then, on the final page, written in a hand that had become almost illegible. December 31st, 1899. They are coming tonight. I can feel them in the darkness, gathering, waiting. The light does not keep them out. The light calls them. I should never have lit it. I should have let the ships find their own way. I should have let the darkness have the sea. If you find this, if you are reading these words, do not light the lamp. Do not let the beam turn. Let the darkness be dark. It is the only way. I have let them in. I did not mean to. But now they are here, and they will not leave, and they know my name. They know your name too. They have always known it. The journal ended there. No more entries. No explanation of what happened on that final night, of how Elias Thorne had been found in the lamp room with the light extinguished, of what he had seen before the relief boat arrived. Thomas closed the book. His hands were shaking. The beam turned above him, sweeping its arc of light across the sea, across the darkness, across the endless winter night. He looked at the lamp, at the flame that burned within the great lens, at the mechanism that turned it, at the light that guided ships to safety. Elias Thorne's words echoed in his mind. Do not light the lamp, do not let the beam turn. But the lamp was lit. the beam was turning. And somewhere in the darkness below, in the hollow behind the loose stone in the cellar wall, something had received the offerings Elias had left. Something was waiting. Something that knew Thomas's name. December 16th, December 31st, 1900, the deepening. The storm that had been building for days finally broke on December 16th. It came not as weather, but as assault, a fury of wind and water that seemed directed, intentional, aimed at the tower, as if the sea had decided to destroy this one small intrusion into its dominion. Thomas experienced it from within the lamp room, watching the waves rise higher than he had ever seen them, higher than the gallery, higher than the lantern itself. The spray froze on the glass, turning the beam into a star seen through frost, dimming its light until it barely reached the base of the tower. He wound the clockwork through the night, every 2 hours, climbing the spiral stair through darkness that pressed against him like a living thing. The tower shook with each wave, groaned with each gust, seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the storm. And beneath it all, beneath the howl and crash and groan, Thomas heard the voices. They were faint at first, so faint he could convince himself they were only the wind playing tricks, only the pressure in his ears, only the imagination of a man alone too long. But they grew clearer as the storm continued, as the days blurred into nights, as the world outside became nothing but grey and white, and the endless assault of water. They spoke in the space between gusts, in the pause between waves, in the moments when the storm drew breath. They spoke in a language that was almost English, almost words, almost meaning, but not quite. They spoke of things Thomas could almost understand, almost see, almost touch. He did not answer them, not yet. He remembered Elias Thorne's journal, remembered the warnings, remembered the way the voices had taken root in the previous keeper's mind until there was nothing left but the sound of them. He resisted. He held onto the routine, onto the logbook, onto the small rituals that kept him anchored in the world of men. December 18th, 1900. The storm continues. Force 10 winds, seas mountainous. The spray freezes on the lantern glass, requiring constant attention to keep the beam visible. I have not slept in 3 days. December 20th, 1900. The storm shows no signs of abating. I have begun to hear things in the wind, voices, perhaps, or only the sound of the sea speaking in its ancient tongue. I will not record them here. Some things should not be recorded. But he did record them, in the small hours of the night, when the darkness pressed closest, and the beam turned and turned and turned. He recorded them in the margins of the logbook, in handwriting that grew smaller and smaller, as if trying to hide the words from anyone who might read them. They speak of the deep. They speak of the spaces between. They speak of the ones who came before. On December 23rd, the storm stopped. Not faded, not diminished, not moved on, stopped. One moment the wind was howling at force 10, the waves crashing against the tower, the spray freezing on the glass. The next, silence. Absolute, complete, impossible silence. Thomas stood in the lamp room, his hand on the clockwork mechanism, and listened to nothing. The sea was still, not calm, but still, as if it had been frozen in place. The wind was gone, the air was motionless. The world had become a painting of itself, flat and silent and deeply wrong. He opened the gallery door and stepped outside. The sea stretched to the horizon, grey and unmoving. The waves had frozen mid-crest, their curves arrested, their foam suspended. The sky was the same grey, featureless and flat, with no sun, no clouds, no differentiation. The air was cold, colder than it had been during the storm, colder than any air Thomas had ever breathed. But there was no wind to carry that cold, no movement to make it felt. It simply was, absolute and unchanging. Thomas stood on the gallery and watched the frozen sea and listened to the silence. It was not a natural silence. It was not the absence of sound that follows a storm, the quiet of exhaustion, the peace of weather spent. It was a silence that had weight, that pressed against the ears, that seemed to listen even as it waited. A silence that was presence. The voices were gone too. In the stillness, in the absolute quiet, there was no sound of speaking, no whisper of words almost understood. There was only the silence, and the cold, and the frozen sea, and the beam that turned and turned above him. Thomas went back inside. He wound the clockwork. He recorded the weather, though there was no weather to record. He sat in the lamp room and watched the beam and waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. The stillness continued through December 23rd, through December 24th, through Christmas Day. No wind, no waves, no sound. The sea remained frozen, the sky remained grey, the silence remained absolute. Thomas moved through the tower like a ghost in his own story, performing the rituals of keeping even though there were no ships to guide, no weather to record, no world beyond the walls of stone. On December 26th, he descended to the cellar. He did not know why. He told himself he needed to check the stores, to inventory the supplies, to ensure that everything was in order for the long weeks that remained. But as he stood before the door, as he reached for the handle, he knew the truth. He was going to the hollow. He was going to see if anything had been left there since Elias Thorne's time. The cellar was dark and cold, the same as always. The barrels and boxes stood in their places, undisturbed. The air smelled of salt and oil and that other thing, that organic thing, that thing that had once been alive. Thomas crossed to the far wall, to the corner where the darkness was thickest. He knelt, found the loose stone, worked his fingers into the gap. The stone came out easily, as if it had been moved recently, as if someone had been here before him. He reached into the hollow. Something was there. He pulled it out, a small object, wrapped in cloth that had once been white, but was now stained with damp and something darker. He unwrapped it in the light of his lantern, his hands steady, his heart beating with a rhythm that had become the only sound in the world. It was a brooch, silver, tarnished nearly to black, set with a stone that caught the lantern light and threw it back in flashes of deep red. A woman's brooch, old-fashioned, delicate, not the kind of thing a lighthouse keeper would carry with him into solitude. Not the kind of thing that should be hidden in a hollow, behind a loose stone, in the cellar wall. Thomas turned it over in his hands. On the back, engraved in letters so small he had to hold it close to the lantern to read them, was a name. Margaret, his sister's name. Thomas stood in the darkness of the cellar, holding the brooch, and for the first time since the storm began, he heard the voices again. They were not in the air this time. They were in his mind, in his thoughts, in the space between his own inner voice and the silence that had replaced it. They spoke clearly now, without distortion, without the need for translation. "She is waiting for you," they said. "She has always been waiting, but she will not wait forever." Thomas closed his hand around the brooch, felt its edges press into his palm, felt the cold of the silver against his skin. He did not ask how the brooch had come here, how it had found its way into the hollow, what it meant that his sister's name was engraved on the back. He did not ask because he already knew the answer. The voices knew everything. And they were patient. On December 31st, the stillness broke. It happened at midnight, the moment when 1900 became 1901, when the old century died and the new one was born in darkness. Thomas was in the lamp room, watching the beam turn when the wind returned. Not gradually, not with the building force of a natural storm, but instantly, absolutely, as if it had never been away. The tower shook, the windows rattled. The sea, frozen for 8 days, began to move again, not melting, not thawing, but cracking, breaking, the ice shattering into pieces that ground against each other with a sound like the world ending. And with the wind, with the waves, with the returning chaos of weather, the voices returned as well, louder now, clearer, speaking in words that Thomas could understand without effort. "You are chosen," they said. "You have always been chosen. The light calls us, and we come, and we stay, and we wait. You will not leave, you will never leave. You will be here when the tower falls, when the rock crumbles, when the sea finally takes what belongs to it. You will be here forever." Thomas wound the clockwork. He trimmed the wicks. He recorded the weather in the logbook, his hands steady, his mind clear. December 31st, 1900, midnight. The wind has returned. The sea is in motion again. The light burns steadily. He paused, the pen hovering over the page. The voices whispered in the darkness, patient and persistent. He thought of Elias Thorne, of the final entry in the hidden journal, of the words that had been written there. "I have let them in. I did not mean to. But now they are here, and they will not leave, and they know my name." Thomas set down the pen. He picked up the logbook, turned to a fresh page, and wrote a single line. "There is something in the tower with me." He did not know why he wrote it. He did not know who would read it, or what they would make of it, or whether it would join the other mysteries that surrounded the Mewstone, the damaged logs, the broken keepers, the stories that sailors told in taverns on winter nights. But he wrote it, and as he wrote, the voices grew quiet, as if satisfied, as if they had been waiting for him to acknowledge them, as if that acknowledgement was all they had ever wanted. January 1901, the walls. January brought cold so absolute that the paraffin froze in its tank. Thomas discovered it on the morning of January 3rd, when he climbed to the lamp room to find the flame guttering. The oil thickened to the consistency of honey, the light reduced to a dim glow that barely reached the lens. He worked for hours with the small stove, heating the tank, coaxing the oil back to liquidity, keeping the light alive by sheer force of will. But the cold was not only in the paraffin. It was in the stone, in the air, in the bones of the tower itself. It seeped through walls that had stood for a century, through windows designed to keep out the worst of the winter gales, through the layers of clothing Thomas wrapped around himself as he moved through his duties. It was a cold that did not relent, that did not vary, that did not acknowledge the existence of warmth. And in that cold, the scratching began. Thomas first heard it on the night of January 5th, during the long hours between windings. He was sitting in the lamp room, watching the beam turn, when a sound emerged from the silence, a sound so faint he almost missed it, so regular he could not ignore it. Scratch, 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 coming from within the walls, from somewhere below him, from the stone itself. He rose, moved to the spiral stair, listened. The sound continued, steady, rhythmic, deliberate. It was not the random scratching of rats, not the settling of stone, not the expansion and contraction of materials in the cold. It was something else, something that seemed to follow a pattern, to keep a rhythm, to speak in a language of touch. Thomas descended. The sound grew louder as he moved down the stair, clearer, more distinct. It came from the living quarters, from the wall behind his cot, from the space where the stone met the outer darkness. He pressed his ear to the cold surface and listened. Scratch, scratch, scratch. 3 scratches, a pause. 3 scratches, a pause. The same pattern, repeated endlessly, as if something was trying to communicate, trying to send a message through the stone. Thomas stepped back. He thought of Elias Thorne's journal, of the voices in the walls, of the offerings left in the hollow. He thought of the brooch he had found, hidden in the cellar, engraved with his sister's name. He thought of the stillness and the silence and the way the world had stopped for 8 days in December. He did not answer the scratching, not yet. He returned to the lamp room, wound the clockwork, recorded the hour in the log. But as he sat through the remaining hours of the night, he found himself listening, waiting for the pattern to change. It did not change. 3 scratches, a pause, 3 scratches, a pause, through the night, through the next day, through the nights that followed. Always the same rhythm, always the same persistence, always the same question hanging in the air between the sounds. Are you listening? By the second week of January, Thomas had begun to map the scratching. It moved, that was the first thing he noticed. The sound was not fixed in one place. It traveled through the walls, ascending and descending, shifting from one side of the tower to the other, as if whatever made it was exploring the spaces between the stone. Some nights it was behind the lamp room, scratching at the glass, where the beam emerged into darkness. Some nights it was in the cellar, near the hollow where Elias Thorne's journal had been hidden. Some nights it was in the walls of his sleeping room, so close that Thomas could feel the vibration through his cot, through his pillow, through his own skull. He began to record its movements in the logbook, not in the official record, but in the margins, in the spaces between the weather observations and the maintenance notes. He drew diagrams of the tower, marked the places where the scratching had been heard, traced the patterns of its movement through the stone. January 8, 1901. The scratching was in the east wall of the lamp room tonight. It remained there for 3 hours, then moved downward. I followed it to the living quarters, where it stopped behind the stove. It resumed after midnight, now in the west wall of the cellar. It seems to be searching for something. January 10, 1901. The scratching has begun to respond to my movements. When I approach a wall, it grows louder. When I move away, it fades. It knows where I am. It is aware of me. January 12, 1901. I spoke to it tonight. I do not know why. I stood before the wall where it was scratching and I asked what it wanted. The scratching stopped for a long moment, longer than its usual pause. Then it resumed, but the pattern had changed. Not 3 scratches now, but 4. 4 scratches, a pause, 4 scratches, a pause, a new rhythm, a response. Thomas set down the pen and looked at what he had written. The words seemed to belong to someone else, to a man who had lost his reason, to a keeper who had followed Elias Thorne into the same darkness. He thought about destroying the logbook, burning it in the stove, erasing all evidence of what was happening in the tower. But he did not, he could not, because the scratching had become company, the only company he had, the only voice that answered when he spoke, the only presence in the long, cold nights when the beam turned and turned, and the world outside was nothing but frozen sea and empty sky. He was alone, he had always been alone, but the scratching was there, patient and persistent, asking its question through the stone. "Are you listening?" And Thomas, in the depths of January, in the cold that would not relent, in the solitude that had become the only reality he knew, Thomas was listening. On January 15th, Thomas found something behind the wall. He had been following the scratching for hours, moving through the tower as it moved through the stone, pressing his ear to the cold surface, tracking its progress. It led him downward, past the living quarters, past the storage room, past the cistern room, down to the cellar where the hollow waited in the darkness. The scratching stopped when he reached the cellar door. Thomas stood in the entry, his hand on the handle, listening to the silence. The scratching had been constant for days, had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, and its absence was suddenly profound, a void where sound should be, a question without an answer. He opened the door. The cellar was the same as always, dark, cold, smelling of salt and oil, and that other thing, that organic thing that had grown stronger in recent weeks. Thomas crossed to the far wall, to the corner where the hollow was hidden, and knelt before the loose stone. The scratching resumed as he touched it, not from behind the wall this time, but from within it, from the space where the hollow opened into darkness, from the place where Elias Thorne had hidden his journal, from the depths where something waited. Thomas worked the stone loose, reached into the hollow. His hand touched something that was not stone, not leather, not cloth, something that was soft and cold and yielding, something that moved slightly at his touch, something that was alive. He pulled his hand back, stumbled away from the wall, fell against the stacked barrels behind him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath came in gasps, his mind raced through possibilities that all ended in the same impossible conclusion. There was something in the hollow, something alive, something that had been there since before he arrived, since before Elias Thorne, since before the tower was built. The scratching continued, steady and patient, as if nothing had happened. Thomas approached the wall again. He forced himself to look into the hollow to see what his hand had touched. It was a root, a single root, pale and thin, emerging from the stone as if the rock itself had grown it. It was soft with damp, cold to the touch, and it moved, not with the movement of a living thing, but with the movement of something that was responding to presence, to proximity, to the warmth of a human hand. Thomas reached out, touched it again. This time he did not pull away. He felt the root against his fingers, felt its slight pulse, felt the way it seemed to lean toward him, to seek him out, to know him. And in that moment, he understood. The scratching was not in the walls. The scratching was the walls. The stone itself was alive, was speaking, was reaching out through the roots that grew from its depths. The tower was not built on the rock. The tower was built into the rock, and the rock was old, older than the sea, older than the land, older than the world. The rock had been waiting, for centuries, for millennia, for eons, waiting for someone to listen. Thomas pulled his hand away, replaced the stone, left the cellar. He climbed the spiral stair to the lamp room, wound the clockwork, recorded the hour in the log. He did not write about what he had found. He did not write about the root, about the pulse, about the understanding that had come to him in the darkness. But as he sat through the night, watching the beam turn and turn, he found himself pressing his ear to the wall beside him, listening to the scratching, listening to the rhythm, listening to the voice of the stone. And for the first time, he began to answer. January 15th, 1901, the discovery. Thomas read Elias Thorne's journal again that night. He had kept it hidden in his sleeping quarters, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked beneath the mattress where no one would find it. He had not looked at it since the first reading, had told himself that the words were the ravings of a broken mind, that they meant nothing, that they had no bearing on his own experience. But now, after the root, after the pulse, after the understanding that had come to him in the cellar, he needed to read it again. He needed to know how much of what he was experiencing had been experienced before. He needed to know if there was a way out. He sat on his cot, the journal open on his lap, the lamp burning low beside him. The scratching continued in the walls, steady, patient, familiar. It had become a part of the tower's sound now, as natural as the turning of the beam, as expected as the wind. He turned to the entry for December 15th, 1899, the day Elias had first found the hollow. December 15th, 1899. I have found something in the cellar, a loose stone, a hollow behind it. I do not know who placed it there or why, but I have begun to leave things in the hollow. Small things, offerings. The voices seem pleased. Offerings. Thomas thought of the brooch he had found, the brooch with his sister's name engraved on the back. Had Elias left it there? Or had something else placed it in the hollow, something that knew Thomas's history, something that had been waiting for him? He read on. December 18th, 1899. The voices have shown me things that have not happened yet, things that will happen. They showed me a woman sitting at a table in a kitchen I have never seen. They showed me her face, her hands, the way she lifts a cup to her lips. They told me her name is Margaret. They told me she is waiting. Thomas felt the cold settle deeper into his bones. Margaret, his sister, the same name engraved on the brooch, the same name he had written in letters he could not send. December 20th, 1899. The voices have shown me more. They have shown me the woman in the kitchen, but now she is not alone. There is a man with her, a man whose face I cannot see, whose shape is familiar. The voices say the man is me. They say I will leave this place, that I will find her, that she will be waiting. But when I ask how, they do not answer. They only show me the kitchen, the table, the woman with my name on her lips. Thomas turned the page. The handwriting was shakier now, less controlled, as if Elias had been writing in darkness, by feel, by memory. December 23rd, 1899. I have begun to doubt the voices. They show me things I want to see, things I long for, but they do not show me the way. They only show me the destination, over and over, as if the journey does not matter. As if the only thing that matters is that I see it, that I want it, that I am willing to do anything to reach it. December 25th, 1899. Christmas Day. I sat in the lamp room and watched the beam and thought of the woman in the kitchen. I do not know who she is. I do not know why the voices show her to me. But I have begun to believe that she is real, that she exists somewhere, that if I could only find my way to her, everything would be different. The voices tell me I will find her. They tell me I only need to wait. They tell me the waiting is almost over. The entry for December 26th was different. The handwriting was larger, more desperate, the words pressed into the page with an urgency that had left grooves in the paper. December 26th, 1899. I have seen something in the walls, not with my eyes, with something else. Something that sees through stone, through darkness, through the space between. There is something in the walls with me, something that has always been there, something that the voices serve. They are not voices, they are not spirits, they are not anything I have a name for. They are old, older than the rock, older than the sea, older than the world. They have been here since before anything was here, and they are hungry. They are always hungry. Thomas closed the journal. His hands were shaking, though the lamp room was warm enough, though the stove burned steadily, though the scratching in the walls had become almost soothing. He thought about the woman in the kitchen, the woman the voices had shown to Elias Thorne, the woman with Margaret's name, with Margaret's face, with Margaret's hands lifting a cup to her lips. Had the voices shown the same vision to Elias that they were now showing to Thomas? Had they used the same name, the same image, the same promise? And if so, what had happened to Elias when he tried to reach that kitchen, that woman, that impossible destination? Thomas knew the answer. Elias had been found in the lamp room with the light extinguished, staring at something only he could see. He had been carried to the asylum, where he sat in silence, listening to something that spoke to him from the dark. He had never reached the kitchen. He had never found the woman. He had never left the tower, not really, not in any way that mattered. The voices had shown him what he wanted, and then they had taken everything else. Thomas looked at the journal in his hands, at the final entries, at the words that had become almost illegible. December 28, 1899. I tried to leave today. I opened the door, walked out onto the landing stage, looked at the sea, but the sea was frozen, not with ice, but with something else. Something that held it still, that kept it from moving, that made it impossible to cross. I stood on the rock and looked at the frozen water and knew that I could not leave. Not yet, not until they were finished with me. December 30th, 1899. They have shown me the woman again. She is closer now. I can almost see her face, almost hear her voice. She is calling to me, calling my name, telling me to come home, but I do not know the way. I have never known the way, and the voices will not tell me. December 31st, 1899. The last day of the year, the last day of the century. I am sitting in the lamp room, watching the beam turn, listening to the voices. They are louder tonight, more insistent. They tell me that the time is coming, that the waiting is almost over, that soon I will understand everything. I do not want to understand. I want to go home. I want to see the woman in the kitchen, to sit at her table, to hear her voice. But the voices will not let me go. They will never let me go. I have let them in. I did not mean to. I only wanted to hear another voice. But now they are here, and they will not leave, and they know my name. They know your name too. They have always known it. Thomas closed the journal. He sat in the silence of his sleeping room, listening to the scratching in the walls, feeling the cold that never relented, knowing that he was following the same path Elias Thorne had followed, that he would end in the same place, that the voices would take everything from him as they had taken everything from the keeper who came before. But knowing was not the same as being able to stop. Knowing was not the same as being able to turn away. The scratching continued, patient and persistent, and Thomas found himself leaning toward it, listening, waiting for the pattern to change, waiting for the voices to speak. They did not speak that night. They did not need to. They had already shown him what they wanted him to see. They had already given him a reason to stay. The woman in the kitchen, his sister's face, the promise of home. He would not leave. He could not leave. The voices had made sure of that. On January 20th, Thomas made a choice. He had spent the days since reading Elias' journal in a kind of daze, moving through his duties automatically, performing the rituals of keeping without thought, without feeling. The scratching continued in the walls, constant and familiar, and Thomas had begun to answer it, not with words, but with presence. He would stand before a wall and press his palm to the stone, and the scratching would increase, would become more urgent, as if something was responding to his touch. He knew it was madness. He knew he was following Elias Thorne into the same darkness, the same isolation, the same dissolution of self, but knowing did not matter. Knowing was a small thing, a distant thing, a thing that belonged to the man he had been before the winter, before the tower, before the voices. That man was gone now. Thomas could feel him fading, day by day, hour by hour, replaced by something else, something that listened to the walls, that answered the scratching, that waited for the voices to speak. The choice came on January 20th, in the hour before dawn. Thomas was in the lamp room, watching the beam turn when the scratching stopped, not paused, not shifted, stopped completely for the first time in weeks. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing, a void where sound should be. He waited, the silence continued. The beam turned, the lamp burned, the world outside remained frozen and still, but the scratching was gone. Thomas rose from his chair. He moved to the wall, pressed his palm to the stone. Nothing, no vibration, no response, no sign that anything had ever been there. He descended the spiral stair, moving through the tower room by room, pressing his hand to every wall. Nothing. The tower was silent, silent as it had been before the scratching began, silent as it must have been for Elias Thorne in his final days. Thomas reached the cellar. He crossed to the far wall, to the corner where the hollow waited. He knelt, worked the stone loose, reached into the darkness. The root was gone. In its place there was something else, a piece of paper, folded small, wedged into the space where the root had been. Thomas pulled it out, unfolded it in the light of his lantern. The handwriting was familiar. It was his own. January 20th, 1901. I have made my choice. I will stay. I will listen. I will let them in. He stared at the words, at the handwriting, at the signature at the bottom of the page, his signature, written in ink that was already dry, already old, already part of the tower's history. He had not written this. He had never seen this paper before. And yet the handwriting was unmistakably his. The words were words he might have written. The signature was the signature he had used for 47 years. The scratching resumed. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, from the stone itself. It was not the scratching of something moving through the tower. It was the scratching of the tower itself, of the rock that had been here since before the world was the world, of the voices that had always been waiting. They spoke as one voice now, clear and unmistakable. You have chosen, you have always chosen. The light calls us, and we come, and we stay, and we wait. You will not leave, you will never leave. You will be here when the tower falls, when the rock crumbles, when the sea finally takes what belongs to it. You will be here forever. Thomas stood in the cellar, listening to the voices, feeling the stone vibrate around him, knowing that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He did not fight it. He did not want to fight it. The voices were company, were presence, were the only thing that filled the silence that had pressed against him since December. He climbed back to the lamp room. He wound the clockwork. He recorded the hour in the log. January 20th, 1901. The scratching has returned. It speaks now in words I can understand. It tells me I am chosen. It tells me I will never leave. I believe it. I have let them in. February 1901. The company. February came with cold so absolute that time itself seemed to freeze. Thomas no longer marked the days as he once had. The logbook recorded the weather mechanically, wind direction, sea state, visibility, but the entries had become sparse, irregular, written in a hand that grew stranger with each passing week. The letters slanted where they had once been straight, the words crowded together where they had once been spaced with care. The sentences trailed into nothing where they had once been complete. But the other logbook, the one hidden beneath his mattress, the one written in darkness, the one that contained the real record of his winter, that logbook grew fuller every night. He wrote in it by the light of a single candle, sitting on his cot, listening to the voices that spoke to him from the walls. They had become clearer now, more distinct, more human in their cadence. They spoke in complete sentences, in thoughts that built upon each other, in conversations that stretched through the long hours of darkness. February 3rd, 1901. They have names now, or at least they have sounds that serve as names. I cannot write them. The pen will not form the letters, the paper will not hold the ink, but I hear them clearly. They tell me stories of the deep, of the spaces between worlds, of the things that wait in the darkness where light has never reached. February 5th, 1901. They know everything about me. They know my childhood, my parents, the house where I grew up. They know the names of my friends, the faces of my lovers, the secrets I have never told anyone. They know Margaret, my sister, my Margaret, and they speak of her as if they have known her always. February 7th, 1901. I asked them tonight how they know these things. They laughed, a sound like stones grinding together, like the sea against the rock, like nothing I have ever heard. They said they do not need to know. They said they simply are, and in being, they contain everything. They said that I am in them, that I have always been in them, that I will be in them forever. Thomas set down the pen and looked at what he had written. The words seemed to belong to someone else, to a man who had crossed some boundary that could never be recrossed. But as he read them, he knew they were true. He knew that the voices contained him, that they had always contained him, that the man he had been before the winter was only a shadow of the man he was becoming. The scratching in the walls had changed. It was no longer the random movement of something searching. It was rhythm now, pattern, language. It spoke to him in pulses that he had learned to read, in vibrations that he had learned to interpret, in a code that only he could understand. He pressed his palm to the wall beside his cot, and the scratching responded, 3 quick pulses, a pause, 3 quick pulses. The pattern he had come to recognize as greeting, as acknowledgement, as the beginning of conversation. I am here, he thought, and the scratching seemed to hear him, seemed to answer with a longer pulse, a holding of the rhythm, a confirmation. He was not alone. He would never be alone again. The voices told him stories. Night after night, through the long hours of darkness, They spoke of things that had happened before the tower was built, before the rock rose from the sea, before the world was the world. They spoke of a time when there was no light, no land, no separation between sea and sky, only the deep, only the darkness, only the waiting. They spoke of the first men who came to the rock, fishermen, perhaps, or sailors wrecked on the coast, or pilgrims seeking something they could not name. They spoke of the things those men saw in the darkness, the things they heard in the wind, the things they left behind when they fled or when they stayed. They spoke of the building of the tower, the stone cut from the rock, the walls raised against the sea, the light kindled for the first time. They spoke of the keepers who had come and gone, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. Some had lasted longer than others. Some had left in spring, their minds intact, their souls untouched. Others had stayed too long, had listened too carefully, had let the voices in. Elias Thorne was not the first. He would not be the last. February 10th, 1901. They told me tonight about a keeper named Matthew who came to the Mewstone in 1847. He lasted 3 winters, longer than any before or since. They said he learned to speak their language, to move in their world, to become something between human and stone. They said he chose to stay when his relief came, refused to leave the tower, remained here until his body failed and something else took its place. They say he is still here. They say he is in the walls with them, part of the stone, part of the voice. They say I will join him in time. Thomas did not know if he believed this. He did not know if any of it was real or if the voices were only the product of his isolation, his exhaustion, his slowly dissolving mind. But as the nights passed and the stories continued, he found himself caring less and less about the distinction. Real or not, the voices were company. Real or not, they filled the silence. Real or not, they knew him in ways that no living person had ever known him. And they spoke of Margaret. On February 14th, the voices made him a promise. It came after a long silence, after hours of scratching that had built to a crescendo and then stopped completely. Thomas sat in the lamp room, waiting, knowing that something was about to change. The voice that spoke was different from the others, clearer, more human, more intimate. It spoke from the wall directly behind him, from the stone that had been cold and silent for days. Thomas. He turned. The wall was unchanged. Grey stone, rough texture, the same wall he had passed 1,000 times. But the voice came from it, unmistakably, as if someone stood just on the other side. We have shown you many things, the voice said. We have told you many stories, but there is one thing we have not shown you, one thing we have kept hidden. Thomas waited. His heart beat slowly, calmly, as if this conversation were the most natural thing in the world. Margaret, the voice said, your sister, she is not as you remember her. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter, a fear that had nothing to do with the voices. What do you mean? She is waiting for you, the voice continued. She has always been waiting, but she will not wait forever. She is ill, Thomas, she is dying, and if you do not return to her soon, you will never see her again. The words hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Thomas thought of his sister, her face, her voice, the way she lifted a cup to her lips in the kitchen he remembered from childhood. He thought of the letters he had written, stacked on the table, waiting for April. He thought of the brooch in the cellar, the brooch with her name engraved on the back. How do you know this? He asked. How can you know what is happening in the world beyond this rock? We know everything, the voice said. We have always known everything. The world is in us as you are in us. We see all things, hear all things, know all things, and we know that Margaret is dying. But we can save her. Thomas stared at the wall, at the stone, at the darkness that seemed to move behind it. Save her? How? You know how, you have always known. The light calls us, and we come, and we stay, and we wait. But we can also give. We can give you what you most desire. We can give you Margaret's life, her health, her future. We can give you years with her, decades, a lifetime. All you need to do is stay. Stay with us, Thomas. Stay here in the tower, in the rock, in the darkness. Stay with us forever, and Margaret will live. Thomas closed his eyes. He thought of Margaret, of her face, of her voice, of the life she had lived while he had been away at sea. He thought of the years they might have together, the conversations they might have, the moments they might share. He thought of the letters he would never send, the words he would never speak, the love he would never express if she died before he returned. Forever, he said. What does forever mean? It means what it has always meant. It means the end of time. It means the dissolution of the world. It means that you will be here when the sea finally takes the rock, when the tower crumbles into the deep, when the light is extinguished for the last time. You will be here with us, part of us, forever. But Margaret will live. Margaret will thrive. Margaret will have a long and happy life, full of love and joy and everything you have ever wanted for her. All you need to do is stay. Thomas opened his eyes. The lamp turned above him, its beam sweeping the frozen sea, the empty sky, the darkness that had become his only companion. Stay, he repeated, forever, forever. He thought of Elias Thorne, sitting in this same room, staring at nothing, whispering a name that could not exist. He thought of the journal, the final entries, the words that had become prophecy. He thought of the scratching in the walls, the voices in the stone, the presence that had been here since before the world was the world. And he thought of Margaret, his sister, the only person in the world who had ever truly loved him. I will stay, he said. The scratching resumed, not the random movement of something searching, but a rhythm, a pattern, a celebration. The walls vibrated with it, the floor shook with it, the tower itself seemed to pulse with joy. You have chosen, the voices said. You have chosen, and you will never leave, and Margaret will live, and you will be here forever. Forever and ever and ever. Thomas sat in the lamp room, listening to the scratching, feeling the vibration, knowing that he had made a choice that could never be unmade. The beam turned above him, sweeping its light across the frozen sea, across the empty sky, across the darkness that had become his home. He did not regret it. He could not regret it. The voices had given him what he most desired, Margaret's life, Margaret's future, Margaret's love. All he had to give in return was himself. And himself was such a small thing, such a temporary thing, such a meaningless thing in the face of forever. He smiled a small smile, a sad smile, a smile that Elias Thorne might have worn in his final days, and settled back against the wall, feeling the stone against his back, feeling the vibration of the scratching, feeling the presence that surrounded him. The voices whispered in the darkness, soft and comforting. Stay with us, Thomas, stay with us forever. And Thomas, the keeper of the Mewstone, the man who had come to this rock in December and would never leave, closed his eyes and listened. February 15th, March 1st, 1901, the descent. The logbook became something else entirely in the second half of February. Thomas no longer pretended to record the weather. He no longer noted the state of the sea, the direction of the wind, the visibility at dawn. The official log, the one that would be read by the Trinity House authorities, the one that would become part of the permanent record of the Mewstone, contained only blank pages after February 12th. Blank pages that would later be cited as evidence of his breakdown, his descent, his loss of self. But the other logbook, the hidden one, the true one, the one that would never be read by anyone who could understand it, that logbook grew fuller with each passing night. Thomas wrote in it by candlelight, sitting on his cot, his back against the wall where the scratching was loudest. He wrote in a hand that grew larger and more erratic as the days passed, the letters sprawling across the page, the words crowding together, the sentences circling back on themselves like a mind caught in an endless loop. February 15th, 1901. They have shown me Margaret, not in vision, not in dream, in the wall. The stone becomes clear, becomes window, becomes door. I see her sitting at her kitchen table, the same table I remember from childhood, the same chair, the same light falling through the same window. She is older now, we are both older, but her face is the face I have always loved. She is alive, she is well, she is waiting. They have kept their promise. February 17th, 1901. I asked them tonight if I could speak to her, through the wall, through the stone, through whatever it is that shows me her image. They said no. They said that speaking would change things, would alter the balance, would risk everything. They said I must be content to see her, to watch her, to know that she lives. I am content. I am content to see her. I am content to watch. I am content to know that she lives, that she thrives, that she will have the long and happy life they promised. But sometimes, in the darkness, I wonder if she knows I am watching. I wonder if she feels my presence, my love, my longing. I wonder if she looks toward the sea, toward the rock where her brother sits in solitude, and feels something, a warmth, a memory, a recognition. The voices say she does not. The voices say she cannot. The voices say that is the price of her life, her health, her future. I pay it willingly. By February 20th, Thomas had begun to forget. It started with small things, the names of friends he had known at other stations, the faces of keepers he had served with, the details of conversations he had had in the world beyond the rock. He would reach for a memory and find nothing, a blank space where a person should be, an emptiness where a life had been lived. The voices explained it to him gently, patiently, as if teaching a child. You are becoming part of us, they said. The things of the world are fading because you no longer belong to the world. You belong to us now. You belong to the stone, to the darkness, to the deep. The memories of the world are like dreams, pleasant perhaps, but not real, not anymore. Thomas accepted this. What else could he do? The memories were fading, and he could not stop them, and the voices were all that remained. But some memories would not fade. Some memories burned too brightly, were too deeply etched into the fabric of his being. Margaret! He still saw her in the wall, still watched her move through her days, still felt the love that had sustained him through decades of solitude. Her face was clear, her voice was clear, her presence was as real to him as the stone against his back. The voices could not take her from him. They would not take her from him. She was the reason he stayed, the price he paid, the promise that kept him going through the endless darkness. February 22nd, 1901. I watched her today through the wall. She was baking bread, the same bread our mother used to make, the recipe she learned at our mother's knee. I could almost smell it, almost taste it, almost feel the warmth of the oven. I pressed my hand to the stone and tried to reach her, tried to touch her across the impossible distance. The stone was warm, warmer than it should be, warmer than anything in this frozen tower has any right to be. I do not know if she felt me. I do not know if she knows I am here, watching, loving, waiting. But for a moment, just a moment, she paused in her work and looked toward the window, toward the sea, toward the direction of the rock where I sit writing these words. She smiled. It was enough. It will always be enough. By March 1st, Thomas's logbook entries had become circular, repetitive, obsessed with certain phrases. He wrote them over and over, filling page after page with the same words, the same thoughts, the same desperate clinging to meaning. The light shows the way. The light shows the way, but the way leads nowhere. The light shows the way, but the way leads nowhere. And I am here, and I will always be here, and Margaret lives, and that is enough. The light shows the way. The light shows the way. The light shows the way. The scratching in the walls had become constant now, not the intermittent movement of something searching, but a steady rhythm, a pulse, a heartbeat that filled the tower with its presence. Thomas no longer noticed it as separate from himself. It was the sound of his own existence, the music of his own being, the proof that he was not alone. On March 1st, he wrote something new. March 1st, 1901. I have seen what the light sees, not in vision, not in dream, in truth. The voices showed me tonight. They opened my eyes and let me see through the beam, through the turning lens, through the light itself. The light sees everything. It sees the ships that pass in the night, the sailors who watch for its gleam, the families waiting on distant shores. It sees the sea in all its moods, calm and storm, life and death, beginning and end. It sees the rock on which it stands, the tower that houses it, the man who tends it. It sees me, it has always seen me, it has always known me. But it sees something else too, something beyond the sea, beyond the world, beyond the reach of human understanding. It sees the darkness that waits beyond the light, the deep that has no bottom, the silence that has no end. It sees the voices, the presence, the thing that has always been here. The light sees them, and they see the light. They are the same. Thomas set down the pen. He looked at the words he had written, at the truth they contained, at the understanding that had come to him in the darkness. The light and the voices were the same. The beam that guided ships to safety was the same beam that called things in from the deep. The tower that protected sailors from the rocks was the same tower that held something that had been waiting since before the world began. He had not known this when he came to the Mewstone. He had not known that the light was a beacon for more than ships, that the darkness it held at bay was not the darkness of night, but the darkness of something older, something hungrier, something that had been waiting for centuries to be called. But he knew now, he knew everything. And knowing, he understood that there was no escape. There had never been any escape. The light would turn forever, and the voices would speak forever, and Thomas Howell would be here forever, watching through the beam, seeing everything, being everything, becoming nothing. He picked up the pen. He wrote one more lines. I have seen what the light sees, and the light sees everything. Then he closed the logbook, blew out the candle, and sat in the darkness, listening to the scratching, feeling the vibration, waiting for whatever would come next. The voices were patient. The voices were always patient. And Thomas, the keeper of the Mewstone, was patient too. March 1901, the last days of winter. The storms returned in March, but Thomas no longer recorded them. He knew they were there, could feel them in the shaking of the tower, in the howl of wind against the glass, in the spray that froze on the lantern and had to be chipped away by hands that no longer felt the cold. But he did not note them in the official log. He did not note anything in the official log. The pages remained blank, white and empty, waiting for words that would never come. The hidden log, however, continued to grow. Thomas wrote in it every night by the light of a single candle, his back against the wall where the scratching was loudest. He wrote of the voices, of Margaret, of the things he saw through the wall when the stone became clear. He wrote of the light and what it showed him, of the darkness and what it contained, of the space between where he now lived. March 3rd, 1901. The storms are back, but I barely notice them. The voices are louder than the wind, clearer than the thunder. They tell me stories I have heard before, stories of the deep, of the spaces between worlds, of the things that wait in the darkness. I do not mind the repetition. Repetition is comfort. Repetition is home. March 5th, 1901. I looked at the official log today. The last entry is dated February 12th. I do not remember what I wrote. I do not remember anything about that day. The voices say it does not matter. The voices say that only the hidden log matters, only the true record, only the words I write for them. I believe them. I always believe them. March 7th, 1901. Margaret came to the wall tonight, not her image, she was there on the other side of the stone, looking at me with eyes that were not her eyes. She spoke with a voice that was not her voice. She said she was proud of me. She said she understood why I had to stay. She said she would wait for me, forever if necessary, until the end of time, until the dissolution of the world. I tried to touch her. My hand passed through the stone as if it were water, as if it were air, as if it were nothing. I felt her face, her warmth, her life. I held her in my arms across the impossible distance. She smiled, she faded, she was gone. But she will return, the voices promised. She will return whenever I need her, whenever I call, whenever the loneliness becomes too much to bear. I am not lonely anymore. By March 10th, Thomas had stopped distinguishing between the wall and the world. The stone was no longer a barrier, no longer a boundary, no longer a separation between himself and the voices. It was a medium, a connection, a bridge. He could move through it when he chose, could pass his hand into the darkness on the other side, could feel the presence that waited there like a mother waiting for a child. The voices spoke to him constantly now, their words woven into the fabric of his thoughts, their presence inseparable from his own. He no longer knew where he ended and they began. He no longer cared. March 10th, 1901. I am becoming part of them. I can feel it happening, feel the dissolution of the boundaries that once defined me. My memories are fading, my identity is fading, my self is fading. But what replaces it is larger, older, more real. What replaces it is everything. March 12th, 1901. I saw the tower from outside tonight. I do not know how, perhaps through the eyes of the light, perhaps through the eyes of the voices, perhaps through eyes that are no longer mine. I saw it rising from the rock, white against the darkness, its beam turning and turning and turning. I saw myself inside it, sitting in the lamp room, writing in this logbook by candlelight. I saw myself and I was not myself. I was something else, something that had always been here, something that would always remain. March 14th, 1901. Margaret came again. This time she did not speak. She only looked at me with those eyes that were not her eyes, that were the eyes of something older, something wiser, something that had been waiting for this moment since before the world began. She held out her hand. I took it. We stood together on the threshold between the world and the stone, between life and death, between everything and nothing. She smiled, I smiled, we stepped through. On a date that Thomas did not record, the final entry began. He had stopped marking days by then. Time had become meaningless, a river that flowed in both directions, a circle that returned always to the same point, a loop that contained everything and nothing. The storms had ended, or they had not ended. The winter had passed, or it had not passed. The world continued, or it did not continue. None of it mattered. None of it was real. Only the voices were real. Only the stone. Only the darkness. Thomas sat in the lamp room, the hidden logbook open on his lap, the candle burning low beside him. The beam turned above him, sweeping its light across a sea that might have been frozen, might have been open, might have been anything at all. He did not look at it. He did not need to look. He was the beam, and the beam was him, and the light and the darkness were the same. He picked up the pen. He began to write. I am still here. He paused. The words felt right, true, complete, final. He wrote them again. I am still here. And again. I am still here. The scratching in the walls joined him, matching his rhythm, speaking his words in a language of vibration and stone. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. He wrote it again, and again, and again. The candle burned lower. The pen scratched across the paper. The words filled the page, line after line, column after column, until there was no room left, until the page was full, until the ink ran thin and the pen began to tear through the paper. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. He turned the page. He kept writing. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent, more joyful. The voices sang with him, chanted with him, celebrated with him. He was theirs now, completely and forever, and they were his, and the boundary between them had dissolved into nothing. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. The candle went out. The darkness was absolute, but Thomas did not stop writing. He did not need light to see the page. He did not need eyes to form the letters. He was part of the stone now, part of the darkness, part of the voice that had always been here and would always remain. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. He wrote until there were no more pages. He wrote until the pen was dry. He wrote until his hands stopped moving and his heart stopped beating and his body became what it had always been, a temporary vessel for something eternal. The scratching continued. The voices continued. The beam turned above him, sweeping its light across the frozen sea, across the empty sky, across the darkness that had become the only home it had ever known. And in the walls, in the stone, in the space between the world and whatever lies beyond, Thomas Howell kept writing. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. April 1901, The Relief. The relief boat arrived on April 3rd, 1901. The sea had thawed in the weeks since March, the ice breaking up and drifting away, the waves returning to their eternal rhythm. The birds had returned too, guillemots and razorbills, kittiwakes and gannets, filling the air with their cries, their wings, their endless hunger. The rock that had been silent and frozen for months was alive again, loud again, itself again. The boat that carried the relief keeper was the same boat that had brought Thomas Howell out in December, the same cutter, the same two men at the oars, the same silence between them as they approached the tooth of rock rising from the sea. The older man at the tiller was the same man who had warned Thomas not to go, the same man who had spoken of Elias Thorne and the name he whispered in the asylum. He did not speak now. He only watched the tower grow larger on the horizon, watched its white walls catch the spring sunlight, watched the beam that still turned and turned and turned. The younger man at the oars was new, a replacement for the one who had rowed in December, who had found other work, who had refused to make this crossing again. He pulled at the oars with the strength of youth, with the ignorance of those who had not yet learned to fear. "What's the matter with him?" the young man asked, nodding toward the older keeper at the tiller. The older man did not answer. He only watched the tower, his eyes gray and depthless, his face a mask of something that might have been memory, might have been fear, might have been nothing at all. The boat drew closer. The landing stage appeared, slick with spray, empty of the figure that should have been waiting there. No keeper stood on the rock to greet them. No hand reached down to take their lines. The tower rose above them, silent and white, its beam turning, its door closed, its secrets held within. "He should be here," the young man said. "They're always here when the boat arrives. They've been waiting for months." The older man nodded. "He should be here." They tied up at the landing stage, climbed the wet steps to the rock, stood at the base of the stair that rose 250 steps to the tower door. The birds cried above them, wheeling and diving, filling the air with sound. The sea slapped against the rock below, patient and hungry. "You wait here," the older man said. "I'll go up alone." The young man started to protest, but something in the older man's face stopped him. He nodded, settled onto a ledge near the water, lit his pipe, and waited. The older man began to climb. The stair was as he remembered it, narrow, worn, rising endlessly into the grey spring sky. He climbed slowly, his legs protesting after months on shore, his breath coming in clouds that the wind tore away before they could form. He had made this climb 100 times, 1,000 times, in the years he had served the lighthouse service, but never like this. Never with this weight in his chest, this knowledge in his mind, this fear in his heart. He reached the door. It was closed, as always, but not locked. The handle turned easily in his hand, as if it had been recently used, as if someone had passed through it not long ago. He pushed the door open. He stepped inside. The tower was silent. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of abandonment, the silence of presence. The silence of something that was waiting, listening, watching. The older man stood in the entry, feeling that silence press against him, feeling the weight of it, the age of it, the hunger of it. He had felt this before. On another April day, 2 years ago, when he had climbed these same steps to find another keeper lost in the darkness. "Mr. Howell," he called. His voice echoed in the narrow space, swallowed almost instantly by the stone. "Thomas Howell." No answer, only the silence, patient and absolute. He began to climb. The spiral stair curved upward, past the storage room, past the cistern room, past the living quarters. He checked each room as he passed, empty, orderly, untouched. The stove in the living quarters was cold. The cot was neatly made. The table held a stack of letters, addressed and sealed, waiting for a post that would never come. He continued upward. The lamp room was at the top of the stair, its door slightly ajar, a thin line of light showing through the gap. The older man approached it slowly, his heart beating with a rhythm he did not recognize, his hands trembling with a fear he could not name. He pushed the door open. The lamp was turning. The beam swept its arc of light across the sea, across the sky, across the world beyond the glass. The mechanism ticked and whirred, performing its eternal duty, keeping the light alive through all the years, all the keepers, all the winters that had passed since the tower was built. And on the floor, with his back against the great lens, sat Thomas Howell. He was alive. The older man could see his chest rising and falling, could see his eyes open and staring, could see the slight movement of his lips as they formed words that made no sound. But he was not present. He was somewhere else, somewhere beyond the reach of human voice, somewhere in the darkness that the beam could never touch. "Mr. Howell," the older man said again, softer this time, gentler. "Thomas, it's time to go, the boat is waiting." Thomas did not respond. His eyes continued to stare at something only he could see, something in the corner of the lamp room, something in the wall, something in the space between the light and the dark. His lips moved, forming the same word over and over, a whisper so faint that the older man had to lean close to hear it. "Here, here, here." The older man knelt beside him, touched his shoulder, felt the warmth of living flesh beneath his hand. "Thomas, can you hear me? Can you understand?" Thomas's eyes shifted, slowly, reluctantly, from the corner of the room to the face of the man who knelt before him. For a moment, just a moment, something like recognition flickered in their depths. For a moment, just a moment, Thomas Howell was present. "I am still here," he whispered. "I am still here, I am still here." Then his eyes shifted back to the corner, to the wall, to the darkness, and he was gone again. The older man sat back on his heels. He looked around the lamp room, at the turning beam, at the empty corners, at the shadows that seemed to move against the light. He saw the logbook on the small desk, the official log, open to a blank page, waiting for an entry that had never been made. He saw the hidden logbook on the floor beside Thomas, its pages covered in handwriting, its final pages filled with the same sentence written over and over. He did not read it. He did not need to read it. He had seen its like before on another April day in another keeper's hands. "Come," he said gently, "it's time to go home." He lifted Thomas to his feet, guided him toward the stair, began the long descent to the waiting boat. Thomas moved with him, compliant and silent, his eyes still fixed on something only he could see, his lips still forming the same word over and over. "Here, here, here." They carried Thomas Howell down the 250 steps, placed him in the boat, covered him with blankets against the cold. He did not speak during the crossing. He did not move. He sat in the bow with his face turned toward the sea, toward the rock, toward the tower that grew smaller and smaller on the horizon. The young man at the oars watched him with wide eyes, with unspoken questions, with the first stirrings of a fear that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "What happened to him?" he asked. "What did he see?" The older man at the tiller did not answer. He only watched the tower diminish, watched it become a white speck on the horizon, watched it disappear into the haze of distance and memory. "Some questions," he said finally, "have no answers. Some doors should never be opened. Some lights should never be lit." The young man did not understand. He would understand later, perhaps, after years of crossings, after winters of his own, after the knowledge that came with time and solitude and the long watching of the sea. Thomas Howell spent the remainder of his life in an asylum on the Cornish coast. He never spoke again, not to the doctors, not to the nurses, not to the visitors who came sometimes to see the man who had been found in the lamp room with his back against the lens. He sat in his cell, staring at the wall, his lips moving in a whisper that never became words. But sometimes, in the night, the nurses would hear him. They would pass his door and hear a voice from within, not his voice, not quite, but something like it, something that used his throat and his mouth and his breath to speak words that were not his own. They would hear him speaking to someone, something, in the darkness of his cell. They would hear him answering questions that had not been asked, responding to voices that only he could hear. And always, at the end, the same words. "I am still here. I am still here. I am still here." The lighthouse still stands on the Mewstone, automated now, its light turning without human hand, without human heart, without human presence. The keepers are gone, replaced by machines, replaced by electricity, replaced by the cold efficiency of progress. But those who service the equipment speak of something strange. They speak of a presence in the tower, a feeling of being watched, of being followed, of being accompanied by something that moves in the walls. They speak of sounds in the night, scratching, scraping, the rhythm of something patient and persistent. They speak of the logbook that sometimes appears on the desk in the lamp room, though no one has placed it there, though no one has entered the tower for months. The logbook is always open to the same page. The same words are always written there, in a hand that grows fresher with each passing year, as if someone, something, is still adding to them, still recording, still bearing witness. "I am still here. I am still here. I am still here." The light turns above, sweeping its beam across the sea, across the darkness, across the endless winter night. The ships pass below, guided by its gleam, their sailors unaware of what else that light illuminates, what else it calls, what else it holds at bay. And in the walls, in the stone, in the space between the world and whatever lies beyond, Thomas Howell keeps his eternal watch. He is still there. He will always be there. The light shows the way, but the way leads nowhere. In memory of Thomas Howell, keeper of the Mewstone Lighthouse, who served from December 1900 to April 1901. His official record states that he was relieved of duty due to profound mental exhaustion and spent the remainder of his life at the Stonehouse Asylum in Plymouth. He died in 1954 at the age of 101, still whispering the same words that had been found in his final logbook. The logbook itself was never made public. It remains in the archives of Trinity House, under lock and key, accessible only to those with special permission. Those who have read it speak of it in whispers, if they speak of it at all. Some records are meant to remain closed. Some lights are meant to remain dark. Some stories are meant to end in silence, but the scratching continues. If you listen carefully, on winter nights when the sea is frozen and the wind speaks in tongues, you can still hear it, coming from the walls, from the stone, from the space between the light and the dark. 3 scratches, a pause, 3 scratches, a pause. A question, an invitation, a promise. Are you listening? Vin.